You have joined this morning the viewing of a play. And so this morning we're going to go through a play together called A Human Experiment in the Exercise of Power. As any good formal play would have, we're going to have a prologue. We'll have scenes 1, 2, and 3, and then we're going to have a resolution. And so it might be a little different as we go along, trying to think of subpoints or points or whatnot, but instead we're going to do scenes. So we're going to very bluntly do an open and closed scene for each one. All right, so I apologize if that's a little jarring for you, but we'll get through it. It's very different for me as well. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 18, but just imagine for a moment if we began a play in the 18th act. Right, so we really need a prologue here. So we're going to do a little bit of a history on how we got to where we are. I know that the last few weeks we've been in Genesis, and so I'm kind of the black sheep that kind of took off running the other direction. But we're going to be in 1 Samuel, and so let me give you a little bit of a background, all right? And the first thing you need to remember is that even though we're going to open up, we're going to be in a portion of the text that we're going to talk about King Saul, that Israel didn't always have a king. There was a period of the Judges. You might have heard of the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges, what happens is there's this cycle that continuously repeats. And it starts off, we'll say, at the beginning, at the very top, the height of the circle, where people are living peacefully and well with God, and things are going super well. And then there's this phrase that comes up in the book of Judges often that says, "And a generation was raised up who knew neither the Lord nor his commandments." And so they sin. And when they sin, God sends an opposing army, an opposing force to come judge them, to come overthrow them, to cause life to be not so peachy keen anymore. And the people then remember God, and they go, "Oh my goodness, how did we ever forget?" And they repent and say, "God, please save us." And then he gives them a judge who's a military leader, who's going to go redeem the people from the bad people that God has sent their way because of their sinfulness. And they're victorious. And when they're victorious, they go back up at the top, and man, isn't life so peachy. And then, inevitably, a generation grows up that knows neither the Lord nor his commandments. And this is the cycle of the book of Judges. That's why it's just this crazy cyclical argument that you go, why don't these people understand? How do they keep making the same mistakes? Well, this is important to know because when we come to the book of Samuel, the first one, that we need to know who Samuel is. See, Samuel's a transitional figure. Samuel is the guy, he is the last judge of Israel. He's the last judge of Israel. He's also the first prophet in Israel. And he's also a functioning priest. He does not have the title of priest, but he is a functioning priest. He gives the sacrifices. And so when Israel comes to him and demands a king, Samuel's like, guys, you don't want a king, all right? The king is just going to tax you. Kings ain't all that great, guys. Right? Yeah, no king, man. I don't know if you heard or not, but apparently there's some protesters that protected America against the king here recently. And Samuel was on the front of it saying, no king, no king. And so Samuel's going, you don't want a king. And the people say, no, we want a king. We want to be just like everybody else. And there's a sense of irony in this because, God called Israel out to be a different kind of people. And Israel says, no, we want a king like everyone else. And Samuel goes to God, and God, he says, what do I do? And God says, give him a king. Because they're not rejecting you, Samuel, they're rejecting me as their king. You see, Israel was dethroning God. And they wanted to put a new king, a human king, a tangible king, a flawed king on the throne. So they demand a king, and they get exactly that. Saul is anointed as the first king of Israel, largely because of his stature, because of his appearance. It says he looked like a king. I don't know what that is, but I don't think I got it. Saul looked like a king. He was a good military leader. He was victorious. And so the people appoint Saul. They go, Saul is our king, and so God comes down. and anoints him and gives him his spirit. But just as Samuel had warned, Saul is not perfect. Saul unlawfully makes sacrifices because he was upset that Samuel was late to the party. So if you guys came in late this morning, you got something in common with the prophet Samuel, all right? Samuel's late. Saul says, no, I ain't trying to wait on him all day. I'll just perform the sacrifice myself. And when he does, God says, all right, Saul, you think that you're all powerful, that you're the king and you can do whatever the crap you want to because you're king and that somehow you're bestowed upon you as this ultimate power? Well, let me tell you something. I'm going to establish my throne with another. This kingdom is not going to pass through your loins. Saul, you might think, would have learned his lesson, but instead, in a battle in Amalek, God says to kill everything that is living. It's called being devoted to destruction. God says, that's my life. I am taking it. But Saul decides that he's got better ideas. And so he spares the king, and he spares the choicest livestock. God comes down, and at that moment rejects Saul as king, and even removes his spirit from him, and says, it's not just that you are going to lose it in the future, but now, for all intents and purposes, you ain't my king anymore. In 1 Samuel 16, Samuel then goes to David, anoints him as the future king. Very different than Saul. Saul looking like a king, David definitely not. And so David is anointed as the next king. And then, and before we get into the, next up in 1 Samuel 17, we have David and Goliath. Now I want to just make a quick note that we don't know if this is chronologically written. All right, if David has yet been anointed as king, and it's going to play a little bit into where we're in this morning. So just know we're not entirely sure if this is supposed to be thematic or if it is chronological. But in chapter 17, we have that David defeats Goliath. And you might remember that Goliath is a giant. He is a Philistine warrior. And he calls on Israel and says, let's do a mano a mano. To the victor goes the spoils. Call out your best soldier. All of Israel is scared. David finds out that this guy is like making fun of Yahweh and is like, what is wrong with you guys? You're shaking in your boots. This guy's making fun of your God. Go kill this dude. Someone slaughter him, and nobody wants to. So David says, all right, well, I'll go. David goes, he takes a slingshot, hurls a stone, kills the giant, cuts the giant's head off with his own sword, by the way, which I think is just so awesome. And then we pick up with our scene 1 in 1 Samuel chapter 18. So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and open up. We're going to begin in verse 6. So it says, they were coming home when David returned from striking down the Philistine. The women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? See, when they come into the city, there's this big ado, this big party, as would be common. That when the kings would go out to war, the people would greet him when they came back to sing his praises and talk about how great and glorious he is, how powerful he is, how awesome he is, that he is the one true king. Right? It's a celebration. That's the whole idea. And so what we see here is that the ladies come out of the cities to sing songs to meet King Saul. Right? They're coming out to meet King Saul. But in the midst of this first scene, where Saul's power is threatened, what we see is that instead, David is the focus. David is the focus. You might think, well, maybe we're over-exaggerating a little bit, right? Like maybe it wasn't really that big of a deal. Maybe it was just like they went out to meet King Saul and they're like, oh, hey, David, you're great too. No, look, even the narrator from the very beginning, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the narrator is ascribing the victory to David, this measly nobody little boy. David, who when he went into the tent of the king to prepare to go against the Philistine giant, was too small to fit into the king's armor. He was too weak to pick up the king's sword and wield it and actually be able to go to battle. This little pipsqueak comes back into town, and people, long before iPhones, by the way, had apparently received a raven that this wasn't Saul's victory, that it was David's. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women come out and they meet King Saul. But when they sing in verse 7, Saul has struck down his thousands. You might think like, hey, that's something to be proud of, right? Man, imagine if you are, I know we live in very different times, and you're not supposed to think this way, but to all the men in the room, let me speak to you for a moment. And if you were a warrior right now, old school days, mano-a-mano, face-to-face combat, and you killed thousands of men in battle, that's pretty legit. Right? You're doing something right. And if we stopped right here, we might go, oh no, see, the narrator has it wrong. The narrator is overblowing David. But actually it continues, Saul struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. Now, in case all of you aren't math majors in the room, let me break that down for you. That's 10 times. David is credited with 10 times the number of kills in combat as the king. This nobody shepherd boy. And Saul is king. I don't know if you've watched like basically any movie that had a king in it. Kings don't generally respond well to threats. Saul doesn't just roll this off like water off a duck's back. No, he gets angry. Saul is angry. Starts whining. They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me I only got thousands. What more could he want but the kingdom itself? This is no small deal. David is now a serious threat to his reign, to his throne, to his power. There was a Forbes article in 2016 titled, "Great Leaders Replace Themselves with Great Leaders." Saul did not read that article. He was not looking for a great leader. He wanted to retain his power. And so, we close scene 1. We have a threat. Saul is angry. When scene 2 opens, we see that Saul, takes action against the threat. Look in verse 9. And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand. Interesting footnote. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Apparently he had 2 spears in his hand. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. I want to note here a couple of words worth kind of coming back to. There's this word eyed, and Saul eyed David from that day on. And it's an interesting word here that is used. And it could have a couple of different meanings. I think it probably touches on both. One is the idea of suspicion. Right? Imagine for a moment when your kids come down and they act a little crazy. Maybe they're walking backwards. Oh, hey, Mom, hey, Dad. Oh, nothing, I'm just going to my room. And you're like, I got my eye on you. I don't know what you're up to, but it ain't good. Right? I got my eye on you. And in some sense, I think that's what Saul is saying, that Saul is suspicious. But there's another way of thinking of this, of determined. In fact, it's not an exact parallel, but I want us to consider Jesus and Luke. It says that Jesus set his face on Jerusalem like a flint, that he kept his eyes fixated on Jerusalem, that nothing was going to distract him from then on between he and the cross. He was determined to get to the cross. Perhaps, if you had your clubbing days, maybe your pickup line was, baby, I've had my eye on you since you walked in the room. I was determined to meet you. It's this determination. So I think what we see with Saul when it says that he eyed David from that day on, that he thought of him suspiciously, he thought he was up to no good, but also he was determined to get him. Determined to snuff out the threat. Saul is going to take action against the one that is threatening his power and his throne. And then it says, and Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. You see, it's one thing if I eye suspiciously or determined, whatever that sounds like, whatever that looks like, to an individual that I don't see, right? So that it's out of sight, out of mind, until they pop up and you're like, oh, you! But David is in the presence of the king day by day. That from that day forward, the day that they re-enter Israel, the day that the party is thrown for the king, but David becomes the focus. From that day on, consistently in his presence, Saul, man, he's just constantly reminded of that David and his 10,000s. Saul, being angry, being consistently reminded, and I don't know how you all react when you've had something happen and you're upset. There's a consistent and steady reminder in your life. Usually, you don't calm down. It's this consistent irritant. And so Saul, realizing, you know what? They chose me because I'm a good warrior. I guarantee I could pin this kid, this measly little runt, to that wall right there. Hurls it twice, misses David both times. And if we just kind of gloss over the rest of this text, we might go like, well, people in their anger, they make bad choices. And I'm not saying that he's okay, but, it happens. Haven't you tried to run somebody off the road before? But if we look at verse 13, it says, Saul removed him from his presence, right? Get out of my face. I don't want to be reminded that you exist anymore. And made him a commander of 1,000. Saul himself, who's the lesser of the two warriors, according to this story, killed thousands as one warrior. Saul, unable to kill David himself, says, you know what I'll do? David thinks he's so awesome. People think David is so awesome. Let's see if he can continue killing tens of thousands of people. I'm going to make him a commander of 1,000 and send that unit out to war. That'll teach them. That'll teach the people what kind of a warrior this child is. Saul's consistently after David from that day on. So now David is this man-child going out to battle, going from being a shepherd boy to being a giant killer to now leading raids against Israel's enemies. Going into the Philistine camp, by the way. The guy that just killed their greatest warrior. Being like, oh, by the way, I'm back. They probably didn't take too kindly to that. And so we wonder what happens. And the scene closes. The curtains close on scene 2. We go, wait a minute, but David's out to war. What will come of this? Well, in scene 3, Saul sees his power waning because David returns. Looking at verse 13. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw, that's not easy to say, when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. What we see is that David is successful in his missions. That despite Saul's attempts to get rid of him the easier way, where his hands aren't as dirty and bloody, that David continues to go out and come in. Again, looking at what a king does. That when a king goes to war, there's a send-off party. That he goes out before the people, before the eyes of the people who come in and say, we wish you well, good luck, come back safely. And then he does, and he comes back in. And they go, woohoo! David, you're victorious again. Who'd you defeat this time? What are the plunders of war like? He doesn't do it one time. It's a thing. It's something he did. He would go out before the people and he would come back before the people. The king's treatment, again, being granted to David. And keep in mind, by the way, we don't know if anyone knows that David has been anointed king at this point. This is part of the side, I forget what it's called because I'm not a drama person, but the side talk, right? That like the other characters don't know about. We got brought in on a secret, perhaps. But the people are treating David, giving him the king's treatment. And David has the favor. Right? David has favor with God. Saul has recognized this in verse 12, and it says that Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. Right? That despite the fact that God had removed his spirit from Saul, that he had given it to David. That David was clearly in the presence of God wherever he went. And here we see it again. That David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. But it wasn't just some hyper-spiritual thing between David and God, right, that Saul could somehow ignore. That maybe it wasn't quite as in his face, and it's like, as long as I don't think about it, whatever. No, he had great favor among the people as well. It was constantly in his face. It says that while Saul had fearful awe of David because of what God was doing, it says, contrary to what how the king felt, instead, Israel and Judah, all the people loved David. Now, I don't think the implication is that they hated Saul. But man, what a threat. Hey, King Saul, if you thought that you were going to somehow lessen this threat on your power, on your throne, if you thought that somehow you were going to extinguish the flame, you have not, good sir. If anything, you have fanned that flame. There we go. Thank you. Jacob was going to yell it for me. You have fanned that flame. You have caused the sparks to grow and to spread. David seems more and more like a king every day. This threat does not end. And nor does Saul's capacity to attempt to extinguish it. You see, our text kind of closes here in scene 3 But I'm going to bring you in on a little bit of a secret, the unspoken scene 4. Which is that this doesn't end. It's not as if at this point Saul accepts defeat and goes, well, I guess just David's going to be my best warrior until he takes over. No, again, Saul eyed David from that day on, unending. You see, in the very next passage, starting in verse 17, it talks about how Saul decides to make a political ally, a power ally with David so he wouldn't be a threat. He tries to marry him off and successfully does marry him off to his daughter. And when that doesn't work, starting in verse 19, he starts to try to kill David again with his own hands. And when David is warned by Jonathan, Saul's son, because they're besties, Saul, instead of hunting the enemy, decides to chase David through caves to try to kill him. The king, who should have been going to war in the first place, going in and out before the people, and instead sent David to do it, is now again not fighting the enemy. He's instead seeking out the one who God has anointed as his replacement. If Saul could just thwart God's plan, then his child could be king. And he could be king peaceably. You know, at this point, it'd be really easy to make this a choose your own Bible character kind of thing. To immortalize David. To say, you know what, man, David in the cave at one point, Saul is relieving himself. He's taking a leak. And David is hiding out. Saul doesn't know he's there. And David, knowing that he's supposed to be the king, could jump out, swing, all done, thread over. His life is no longer at stake, and you would assume then he becomes king. That the throne could be his. All the power of the king of Israel could be his. He doesn't do it. And it'd be really easy to go, see, like Saul did everything he could to maintain his power, and David did not seek out that power, did not seek out that throne. In fact, even when Saul dies in battle, 2 Israelites take credit for killing him, and David has them executed. Because you don't kill the king of Israel. That'd be really easy, wouldn't it? That'll preach. Here's the thing. David is just as flawed. David's reign is just as problematic. David, by the way, takes Saul's practices and perfects them. You see, Saul said, I can't kill this guy. I'm going to see if somebody else can. I'll send him to war. David steals somebody's wife, impregnates her, and then says, ooh, I got a problem on my hands. I got to marry this chick, which means that her husband has to die. So bring him before me. And then when he doesn't do what David says to do, he then sends him off to war. And instead of just seeing what happens, David says, remove yourselves so that he's left by himself. He ain't coming back. I came back. He's not going to. It's be really easy to make this Saul is bad, David is good. But we'd miss it. We'd miss it. Because what we see is that the human power struggle is a failure. It's a failure. The resolution is not Saul gets his life in order. The resolution is not David is the greatest king of all time and we can just look at him and talk about how great he is, that though he be a man after God's own heart, that he was severely flawed. That he did all kinds of things, including adultery and murder, in order to maintain his crown. Our resolution is not about Saul, it's not about David. Our resolution is God's absolute power. That while David and Saul were playing this weird game of who's in control, who has the power, who's going to be on the throne, God said, time out, y'all. I'm on the throne. I am the king of Israel, and what I say goes. You might have rejected me so that you got a human king because you no longer wanted to be a theocracy. But the reality is, I'm still the guy. I still have the power. I don't know how you feel about Bruce Almighty. I know some people think it's sacrilegious. There's a scene where Jim Carrey gets all the powers of God. And I think of this in the song by, you guys remember Snap from the 90s? They have one hit. I got the power, power. Hey, yeah, yeah. God's got the power. All the power that is in the universe is because God placed it there. Because God is ultimately in control. Because God is the one on the throne, not just in Israel, but period. I think of when Job has all of this treacherous stuff that happens to him. He loses everything he's got, except for, dare I say, a nagging wife and some friends who are terrible at giving advice. He loses everything else, and he calls on God basically with two questions. What did I do to deserve this? Why is it happening? And then the second question is, because I know I didn't do anything to deserve it, why are you not vindicating me to my friends who are saying I'm this awful person? There's this continuous cycle. And God shows up. And he says, all right, Job, I'll answer you if you can answer me. He says, pull your britches up. I'm taking you to task. Do you have the power and authority to tell the waves where to stop? I mean, if we're going to talk about power, who in the world could do that? Did you place the stars in the sky? Tell me, Job, if you can answer me, I'll answer you. And Job, all right, I guess the sovereignty of God is just something I got to accept. How do you answer that? God says, I got the power. You do not. Romans 1:6 reads, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Look, we could talk, there's a zillion passages in the Bible that talk about the power of God. But this morning, I want us to see God's power in every intricate detail of your life. That he is on the throne, whether you acknowledge him or not. And if you're struggling this morning with this desire to have more power, to have more control, to be on the throne, to exercise authority, or if you feel like you have none, you're just getting stepped on, beat up, tore down by those who do. I got one solution for you. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Romans says that the real power of God is found in the gospel. That somehow Saul and David and you and I, these beat up, just jacked up human beings that get everything wrong, man, despite how we might try our absolute hardest. We get it wrong. We fall short. And that Jesus, a perfect, sinless human being, God in the flesh, is born of a virgin, comes and dies on the cross, paying the price that you and I deserve, the price that Saul deserves, the price that David deserves. And that somehow, because Jesus dies for our failures, that somehow we're a new creation. That Jesus now lives inside of us. That even though before God was the king anyway, we now acknowledge him as the king in our own lives. We somehow symbolically place him on the throne in which he already reigns. And we say, it doesn't matter what root sin it is, but you are on the throne. You are in control. And if you haven't done that this morning, you need it. You need it more than having a character to live by, to follow their examples or to not follow their examples. You need it more than me telling you to go out and try to be a good person or to say you should stop doing this or that or the other. Those are all true. But this morning what you need is the gospel. You need Jesus. My assumption is that many in this room, they got Jesus. And so you might think you're about to skate. But Paul here in Romans says, for I am not, as a Christian, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power currently that as believers we need to be reminded of this power of God. That God is on the throne. So that when we get beaten up, we don't say, oh, I'd do so much better if I were on the throne. We go, that fool thinks he's on the throne. Jesus is on the throne. So that we, whenever we feel like, oh my gosh, I need to be more in control. Things would run a lot differently in this organization if I was in control. If I had the authority. If I was the king. No, we take our crowns off. We lay them down at the foot of the cross. And we say, Jesus, you are on the throne. That we need that reminder consistently from today on, from yesterday on, from tomorrow on. So I just have a couple of questions. Little application for you. How are we to be the church and display the kingdom? First question I want to ask you is, are you controlled by a desire for power? And the flip side of that, are you fearful of those with power? Is this one of your root issues? That you need to have the authority, the control? Second question, are you threatened by the success of others? Does it threaten your power when there's another great leader? Does it threaten your authority when your spouse steps in and says something differently, perhaps even with your children? Or when they go to grandma and grandpa's? When you take them to Michigan and they hang out with their cousins and act like fools? It's not personal experience at all. Are you threatened by the success of others? And then finally, in what areas of your life are you failing to trust God and His power? Guys, if your root issue is power, the answer is Jesus. The answer is acknowledging that He is on the throne in the first place. That we cast off that thing, power, authority, the jealousy that stirs up in us that we saw in Saul, the irritation, the desire for more, or for maintaining what we have. That we put it off and we say, God, you have the power. And the power that I have is the gospel. So whatever my position of authority might be, no matter what my role may be, God, I know that you are ultimately in control. You have the power. Let's pray.